And especially talking about General Bajwa, he recently gave an interview to a journalist in which he said that, we were against Imran Khan because he was against the country. And that is very serious statement, actually. And now the journalist has been pressured, I guess, to backtrack from it. And what do think this kind of journalism going on in Pakistan under a lot of duress and under too much pressure? So, what do you see happening in the next few months?
Well, I think it's very clear that there has to be an election sometime soon because this government has no legitimacy. It was not elected. I mean, Shahbaz Sharif was under investigation and being charged with corruption when they installed him. I mean, it's cartoonish. But actually, by the way, I think that's another factor because Imran Khan is not corruptible. Because he already was independently wealthy. He was a very well-known, famous cricketer. I mean, he's not a corruptible person, which means that they can't hold blackmail against him to force him to do what they want. So they prefer someone like Shahbaz Sharif because he's just going to go along with whatever.
And not just him, not just him. Almost the majority of the cabinet, majority of his party and other parties who have joined him, majority of them are corrupt, and they were actually facing the criminal charges.
Exactly. So this government is very unstable. It's very unpopular. You can tell that it's unstable because it has to use repression in order to maintain power. It has to violently repress the marches and protests. It has to repress social media and arrest people for criticizing them. It has to ban Imran Khan's speeches. Those aren't signs of a government that's clearly in power, right? That's clearly in control. It's very unstable. So they're going to have to be elections at some point. And the question is if they can successfully prevent Imran Khan. I don't think they can because if they try to prevent him, he'll just have mass protests across the country. And that's the most important factor in this is that there are so many people that maybe if they don't directly support Imran Khan, at the very least, they're against the unelected government. So that means that they have the majority of the population against them. And for me, I think in terms of Latin America, we can draw a direct parallel to what happened in Bolivia. I personally think the Bolivia scenario is most likely. So in November of 2019, the elected president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, was overthrown in a violent coup, and an unelected coup regime came in, and they governed for 11 months, and they kept delaying the election and delaying the election. But the social movements and the labor unions in Bolivia were so well organized that they had big strikes and protests for 11 months. And eventually, the country became so unstable and the government became so unable to govern that they were forced to hold new elections. And they held new elections, and the party, the Socialist Party of Evo Morales, was so popular they actually won by an even larger margin in the 2020 election in October. I was actually there in Bolivia at the time reporting on it. So I actually think there's a lesson for that in Pakistan. Now, if Imran Khan survives, and that's unfortunately a scary possibility, they already tried to assassinate him.
Yes.
If he does survive, and if he's allowed to run in the election, I think there's no question that he'll probably win with an even larger margin than he won the previous term. And he'll have even more of a solid
This is
base.
what they are afraid of.
And it's not just speculation. I mean, we've seen in 2 different regional elections, including in Punjab, that his party, they won a majority of the seats. So clearly he's going to win if there's an election, which is why the current unelected government keeps trying to delay a new election.
Right. So coming back to the army and General Bajwa thing, first time in our history, I have seen in my life, first time, that the army, not the Air Force or Navy, just the army, is facing the brunt of people's criticism. And approval rating of army is at its nadir. On the other side, there are worst human rights violations going on. Imran Khan, as you said, he was attacked and shot 4 times. People have been threatened. People have been arrested, stripped naked, subject to severe physical and mental torture. Journalists being arrested. Anybody who is talking against them is being arrested.
Journalists being killed as well.
And killed. Israr Sharif was killed, and he was actually hounded out of the country and got killed in Kenya. And you know that the world is silent. UN is silent. All other HR organizations in the world are silent. Isn't it weird?
Well, unfortunately, I can't say it's very weird because in my experience in Latin America, I mean, this has happened so many times. I'll just name a few recent examples. 2002 in Venezuela, at least it was brief. 2009 in Honduras, a military coup. 2012 in Paraguay, there was a similar kind of parliamentary coup like in Pakistan. In 2016 in Brazil, a parliamentary coup like in Pakistan. 2018 in Brazil, Lula da Silva was imprisoned before the election. 2019 in Bolivia. 2022 in Peru. So unfortunately, I mean, what we're seeing in Pakistan, it doesn't surprise me because I've seen it so many times just in the several years I've lived in Latin America. But the difference is that in many of those cases I mentioned, a lot of the people were not able to resist the coup. But the difference is, I think in Pakistan, they will be able to, like they did in Bolivia. I think that's a significant difference today.
Right. Okay. I was just thinking about the options which, Imran Khan has right now. He's been resisting everything. He's been, steadfast all over, through his campaigns. But, he keeps on appearing on different channels as well, occasionally international channels. But I feel that there has not been any concerted effort internationally to raise the awareness among the international public opinion. What should the Pakistani community do, and what should Imran Khan and his party do? Should they build partnerships and alliances with different organizations, groups, and people?
It's a good question. I mean, it's hard to say because I understand that what Imran Khan is doing is he is preparing because I think he knows that he's going to be prime minister again. So I think he's probably being a little careful about trying to get international forces involved because he doesn't want to, like, the U.S. would portray him as like a Chinese puppet or something, right? So I think he knows what to do, certainly better than I do. He's a very good politician. But in terms of what people can do, I think there should be an international campaign to raise more attention to the atrocities being committed, to the corruption of the unelected government and of the military. I mean, we know of the reports that General Bajwa and his family have billions of dollars in corruption. Also, I think it is a good idea to try to work with international organizations. The UN is a complicated institution because when we talk about the UN, there are a lot of different moving parts, right? There are like individual UN experts. There's the UN Human Rights Chief and Human Rights Office, but then there's also the UN General Assembly. And I think that it would be possible to have, there have been UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia over the war in Ukraine, but there potentially, other countries could make a resolution to condemn the violence in Pakistan and the coup in Pakistan. Like, these are all things that could happen. Or, working with the Human Rights Office or human rights organizations internationally to condemn the atrocities being committed in Pakistan and the violations of civil liberties. I mean, I think a lot of the things are happening, but, just trying to organize, and especially, as a community in the diaspora inside Pakistan. I know inside Pakistan it's a bit harder, but organizing and also just making it about restoring democracy. Like this current government, it's not even a matter of Imran Khan necessarily. I mean, obviously he does have a lot of support and he's the most popular politician in Pakistan, but the big protests that have been held by, PTI and Imran Khan, I think they were even surprised by how big the protests were because maybe not everyone who came out necessarily supports Imran Khan, but they oppose the unelected government, which means that you could make a huge mass movement to say, we want to restore democracy in our country.
And especially talking about the overseas Pakistanis, he has a very strong chapter in the US and in the UK as well. So, do you suggest that his chapters in the US, they should organize themselves and protest in front of UN and go to different congressmen and senators and tell them that what's going on, and what is going on is supported by the US government?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they would know what to do better than I would probably, but there's a long history of this kind of social movement activism leading to real change. I mean, if people get together, they can change these policies. I mean, it happened with the Vietnam War. It happened with the civil rights movement. So, I mean, I think definitely, especially in if they do it like with certain Congress people. That's usually the easiest way to do it, is that you can get certain members of Congress to release a statement criticizing the human rights violations in Pakistan, which helps put the pressure on to call for new elections. That could also help put the pressure on, because if there's no pressure from outside, Pakistan can just continue to delay and never have new elections. So that's a great idea. And especially with members of Congress, and especially if members of the Pakistani diaspora and other groups, if they're in like certain districts where a congressperson, might be reliant on their vote, that's definitely a good way.
And do you think Imran Khan will succeed in his mission, or he will be neutralized or eliminated, God forbid?
That's the question. It's hard to say. I mean, unfortunately, there is a possibility that he could be assassinated. They already tried. I'm sure his security is very good, but you never know. But I honestly think, just looking at the political forces, looking at how unpopular the government is right now, also looking at the lack of alternatives, who are they going to have as an alternative? I mean, the irony is that the Bhutto family destroyed their political reputation by having Baliwal Bhutto now as the foreign minister of this completely, unelected, illegitimate government. I mean, he has destroyed, at least maybe I'm wrong, but my impression is that from outside of Pakistan, he's destroyed any possibility of being prime minister, which everyone assumed that he wanted to be. So I think, if Imran Khan can survive, frankly, I think he's going to come back as prime minister. It seems pretty much inevitable, but that's why he has to be protected. And that's why the people have to keep protesting and demanding new elections.
As a matter of fact, what I'm scared of is that today the Lahore High Court has actually ordered to hold the elections within 90 days because the assemblies have been dissolved. So the court has ordered to hold the elections within 90 days. So Imran Khan has to go to campaign. He has to go out, meet with the people. He is still, recovering from that wound shots, and what you can understand how frail and how weak he is. But now he has to go out. So I think he will have to expose himself to the public.
Yeah, well, the real question is if they'll allow him to run, because if they try to have an election where he's not a candidate, everyone will know that it won't be a legitimate election. I mean, banning the most popular candidate, that's exactly what happened. I mean, here's another lesson from Latin America. In 2018, I mentioned that there were 2 coups in Brazil in 3 years, in 2016 and 2018. And both of them were very similar to the coup against Imran Khan, in the sense that they were not violent coups like, the Zia Haq coup. Instead, in 2016, the elected president of the Workers' Party in Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, she was impeached in the same way that Imran Khan was impeached, through corruption by buying votes in the parliament in order to overthrow her on fake charges of corruption, right? Exactly what they did to Imran Khan, right? So after she was overthrown, there was an unelected president who ruled in Brazil for 2 years, and they were forced to hold elections in 2018. But what happened in 2018 is that a few months before the election, Lula da Silva was leading in all of the polls. So the justice system, which is very corrupt in Brazil, like in Pakistan, they imprisoned Lula da Silva on fake corruption charges, which meant that he couldn't run in the election. So because he couldn't run, that's how this far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, won the election, which was not a fair election in 2018. But the lesson from that is that, unfortunately, they were able to imprison Lula, but he was later released. All the charges against him were dropped, and then he won the next election. So it was just a matter of delaying his inevitable return to power. So I think in Pakistan, all they can do is just delay the inevitable return, unless they kill him, frankly. All they can just do is delay the inevitable return. And if they try to have an election without him as a candidate, almost no one in Pakistan will consider it legitimate. And then the new government will be just as unstable and will probably be forced to have a new election anyway.
Good. Talking about the multipolarity, coming back to this Latin America region again, we talked about multipolarity and non-polarity. But do you think the current international economic architecture, designed and underwritten in part by the Americans, can survive a transition away from the U.S. hegemony?
No, frankly, no. That's why we need systematic change. I mean, I'm from the United States, although I've lived in Latin America for several years, and I'm here permanently. But I was born and I was raised in the U.S. And I mean, there needs to be a systematic change. The good thing is that, like in Pakistan, I mean, the vast majority of people want a systematic change. The unfortunate thing is that almost everyone agrees there needs to be significant change, but they disagree what that change could be. Some people, like the Trump supporters, basically want fascism, but there are a lot of people, you know, Bernie Sanders supporters and others, who want a much more progressive change. They don't want U.S. foreign policy to be so hawkish. They don't want so many wars and intervention around the world. They want to have peaceful relations and better relations. And I think that is a possibility, at least, you know, maybe in 20 or 30 years. But I do think that in the next 10 or 20 years, we're in a very dangerous moment, especially now with this proxy war in Ukraine between the US and NATO on one side and Russia on the other. It's very dangerous because, of course, Russia and the US are the world's largest nuclear powers. They're basically at war with each other in Ukraine. The German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, just gave a speech at the in Europe in which she said that we are at war with Russia. So what scares me is that as we see this decline of U.S. unipolar power, that the U.S. is going to try to wage war to prevent the rise of China and Russia, which is clearly what some people in Washington are trying to do. We see this kind of new Cold War where they keep imposing new sanctions, and now there's all this propaganda, like China had this weather balloon they called like a, you know, surveillance balloon and all this. So it's a very dangerous moment. Right. I think, you know, a lot of experts, including the concerned scientists, the Bulletin of Concerned Scientists, you know, who do the doomsday clock, they have said that we're at the closest moment to nuclear war since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's, you know, here we are 60 years later, and we're just as close as we were then to nuclear war, which would mean destruction of the planet. So that's what scares me, is 10 or 20 years in the next 10 or 20 years. If we can avoid World War III, if we can avoid nuclear war, I think it's inevitable that the world is going to have to be more democratized, that there's going to be multiple poles of power. The U.S. is always going to be a powerful country with its big economy, but it shouldn't be the world's biggest, you know, it shouldn't be the world's hegemon. Like, it shouldn't control the world. No country should do that. What we should have more regional democracy. So I think Latin America shows a good model for the future. I think also Southeast Asia is another good model for the future, with ASEAN, the Alliance of Southeast Asian Nations. And Latin America has its own group, which is called the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR. I think that's the path toward the future, is that you have multiple poles of power in, you know, Latin America, North America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, you know, Africa, West Asia. You know, obviously there's still going to be conflicts, but there shouldn't be just one massive superpower that controls the world.
So in this scenario, I have a related question. What do you see the future of transatlantic West after the end of unipolarity and this kind of scenario? Will the West be one pole or several?
Well, this gets back to the war in Ukraine, and it gets back to what we were talking about with the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. That was an attempt by the United States to prevent Russian and European integration, and by extension, Eurasian integration, right? Because Europe doesn't exist. Europe is a political creation. There is no Europe. It's not separate from Asia. It's Eurasia. If you just look, I mean, in many countries in Latin America, they teach there are 6 continents: North America, South America, Eurasia, Africa, Australia. That it's not Europe and Asia. But of course, because of the history of European colonialism, because of racism, there's been this attempt to try to divide Europe as if it's this, you know, separate continent, right? And the U.S., by destroying Nord Stream, that was a major way to prevent economic integration, because, of course, Germany, but other parts of Europe had used a lot of Russian energy, and that was used to power their industries. And Russia and China are economically integrating very, very rapidly. And Pakistan and China are economically integrating. So, I mean, what we see is this Asian integration. And basically, what I've argued since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February is that this was Russia telling the West, after years of NATO expansion up to Russia's borders, after the US backed a coup in Ukraine in 2014 that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected, geopolitically neutral president, Viktor Yanukovych, and installed a pro-Western regime, which is what set off the civil war. And then the US flooded Ukraine with weapons and all of this. So Russia was tolerating since 2014 this civil war fueled by the West on its borders, NATO expanding into the Baltic states, NATO talking about expanding into Ukraine. And then Russia said, we're done with this. We're not going to tolerate this anymore. And now they're saying that NATO is not going to keep expanding. And they said, we're no longer, by invading Ukraine, Russia essentially decided that we're no longer even trying to integrate with Europe. We tried it after the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. We tried to integrate with Europe. And President Putin gave a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, in which he said that there is a hegemon in the world that doesn't allow us to have our independent policies. He was talking about the United States, of course, but he was being diplomatic. And he said that we're over the age of hegemony. We need to get back to an age where countries can have sovereignty. And ever since 2007, Russia has been targeted. In 2008, the U.S. pushed Georgia to attack, which is what set off this war with Georgia. And the New York Times admitted that the U.S. started that war. And then that pushed toward more and more conflict with Russia, leading up to the coup in Ukraine. And throughout this whole time, Russia decided that it's going to integrate with the East, not with the West. And that's where we are today. And it looks like Europe, unfortunately, I mean, I've done interviews with European politicians who said that they no longer feel they have an independent foreign policy, that Washington makes their foreign policy. So what we're talking about, I mean, this is imperialism, and it's very similar to what happened, in Pakistan. At least at this point, the U.S. hasn't backed coups against elected European leaders. But if the people of Europe elect a leader who says, I don't want this new Cold War with Russia and China, and they ally with Russia and China, we could see a coup against them like we saw against Imran Khan.
Right. Final question, and that is regarding the UN. What do you see the role of the United Nations, especially in the changing dynamics all over? Or the question is that, do we need the UN at all?
I shouldn't say I'm a defender. I think the UN is an institution worth saving. Now, I'm very critical of the UN, as I think everyone should be. It's very undemocratic. It's very unequal. But it's the only international institution that we have that isn't entirely dominated by the US, essentially. I mean, the thing about the UN is that we have to separate the Security Council and the General Assembly. If we look at the General Assembly consistently, the Global South votes together as a bloc, and it's the West that votes against the rest of the world. We can see this in so many UN votes that, I mean, there are conflicts. There are differences between India and Pakistan. There are differences between China and India. There are differences between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, obviously. But in the vast majority of UN votes, you can see that it's the West that votes against the rest of the world, which is a sign that the West needs to change its policies. It was the colonial power for hundreds of years, and they need to get over that. They need to become just countries that are equal with other countries, which they refuse to do, which is why they keep waging all these wars. But I think it's inevitable. But the point is that in the UN, I think several things have to happen, however, in order for that to be a truly accountable institution. One, the UN Security Council needs to be completely changed. That means either removing all the permanent members or putting more permanent members on, including, I think, maybe the 10 most populous countries on Earth. That means taking away the permanent seats for France and Britain and giving seats to Pakistan, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil. It's ridiculous they don't have seats, considering that France and Britain, which at this point are minor powers, and they have small populations, considering that countries like Pakistan and India and Indonesia, which have hundreds of millions or over 1 billion people, it's ridiculous they don't have seats on the UN Security Council. But of course, the United States and and Europe oppose that because they know that if there are more countries from the global South, they're going to vote against them, right? So maybe the way is just to have no permanent seats and instead have rotating seats I think the
Right.
rotating system is actually pretty good because you can see that you have representation from Asia and Africa and Latin America. The problem is the
Right.
permanent seats. The other problem is that all of the power is in the UN Security Council, and the General Assembly has no power. So that needs to change as well. Because if you look at the GA votes and the Security Council votes, they're completely different because there's such disproportionate representation of the West in the Security Council. Now, the good news is that Brazil has been lobbying for a seat in the Security Council for years. Lula da Silva has talked about it. I know India and Pakistan have lobbied. Indonesia has. The African Union has also, and the African Union is now demanding representation in the G20. So I think what we're seeing is that some of these institutions can't be saved. For instance, NATO cannot and should not be saved. The European Union cannot and should not be saved. The IMF and the World Bank cannot and should not be saved. But there are other organizations that are emerging: the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, and then there's the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. I mean, those bodies can be more democratic. Another significant change: the UN headquarters cannot be in New York. It's absolutely ridiculous because the U.S. constantly violates the UN hosting agreement that the U.S. signed, and that the UN hosting agreement says that the hosting country has to allow every single every country, which is 193 member states, they need to be allowed to send their representatives to the headquarters. Now, to be fair to Switzerland, which, I mean, I'm not a fan of the Swiss government. It's not truly neutral. It's actually fake neutral. But to be fair to the Swiss government, they allow representatives from every country on earth, represented by the UN, to go to the UN headquarters. In New York, they do not.
They do not.
It started with the Trump administration, and Biden has continued it. They reject Iranian politicians, Syrian politicians, Russian politicians, Venezuelan politicians. That violates the UN hosting agreement. If the UN were
against the spirit of UN.
If the UN were democratic, they would say, we're moving the UN headquarters to, I don't know, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil. I mean, so the point I'm saying is that I think the UN is different from other institutions like the IMF, which is basically just a US colonial institution. The UN has the potential of being more democratic, but it needs many reforms to get there.
Many reforms. Thank you very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure to have you. As I said in the outset, you are known for your insightful analysis, and you came up to your expectations. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.